Hey y'all, Yolanda here. And listen, I have kind of purposefully been quiet in terms of what I've been seeing on social media and on the news regarding the untimely death and murder of Shanquella Robinson. And part of that is I really wanted to see what the Mexican government was going to do in terms of their investigation, because up until that time, it's all speculation and rumors and things of that nature, right? And so obviously, I think one of the other issues, and I'm not going to talk about it in this brief, but I think it also raises issues in terms of why it had to take a social media push and her name becoming a hashtag in order for the Mexican government, ultimately the FBI, to become involved in this, because she died back in October, right? And I think what is particularly interesting about this case is kind of the intersection or the juxtaposition of United States law, Mexican law, federal law as it relates to extradition, some of the history behind all of that. And I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I think it's really important that people kind of understand some of the fundamental basics. Like, one of the big questions I have is, well, can they be charged in the U.S.? What can they be charged for? Aren't they all accessories? Well, there was a conspiracy. Why aren't they being charged here? What's going on with that? And there's a reason. So let me kind of take you back historically to some of the things I think you should know, and most people should know, as far as why this case has levels to it. Okay, so back in the day, like if you watch movies with the bad guys, right? One of the things that they always wanted to do in a lot of these movies, they were all going to Mexico. They just needed to get to the border. They needed to get across the border. They just needed to get to Mexico. Why? Because prior to the extradition treaty that was ratified later in 1978, you could go generally to Mexico and you wouldn't have to worry about extradition. You can kind of just fade off into the sunset. Nobody's coming for you because there was no extradition treaty between the United States and Mexico. So that was why it was like a common theme. And also, you didn't want to get in trouble in Mexico because the thing was, you don't want to get caught up in a Mexican prison. The legal system is so different. It's horrible. You don't want to be a part of that. That was what was going on historically and somewhat glamorized in the movies, right? Things changed then historically. 78 treaty is ratified between the U.S. and Mexico, deals with issues regarding extradition. There's also reform within the Mexican government as far as their judicial system. So there have been a lot of changes. And so while there was never a big issue in terms of someone who is from Mexico commits a crime here in the U.S., they get extradited, it always seemed like there were more layers to, not intentionally, because the law says what it says, from a United States citizen who commits a crime in Mexico, then goes back to the United States and then being extradited. Because more than likely, it wasn't necessarily that a crime was committed, but how was that investigation handled by the Mexican government? So the first thing fundamentally understand is that where the crime is committed is where the jurisdiction lies in terms of how that crime is going to be prosecuted, if at all. So in this case, at least according to the video that's floating around, she was allegedly assaulted, ultimately died as a result of that assault. Was it intentional? Was it murder? Was it manslaughter? All of those things we kind of think about in United States law. Let me step back for a second, because just as the extradition laws changed, so did the basis of Mexican law and how that system fundamentally operated. So prior to reform, generally it was more of an Inquisition-based system. And if you know anything or remember anything about history with the Spanish Inquisition, it was, hey, you did something. This is what you did. You need to prove that you're innocent, that you didn't in fact do it. Where it had evolved through reform to be more of an adversarial system, but sort of similar in some ways to United States law, where there's more protections that are put in place. Now, keep in mind, everything is done in Spanish. But if you don't speak Spanish, you're entitled to an interpreter for everything that happens during that system. If you choose not to speak, for example, that's not used against you, very similar to where it is here in the United States. But there's other differences. That's for another show for another time. But once there was an extradition treaty, again, let me go back to the original point. It happens wherever that crime occurs is that country's responsibility for investigating, determining if they're going to charge. And then that, if that's the case, that's when the extradition process happens, from where Mexico would then, through the federal government, here in particularly the DOJ or Department of Justice, and following federal law, then ask for that person to be returned to Mexico. How does that happen? In general, there can be a provisional arrest by the DOJ on the federal level. That person can be arrested, has to go through some complicated procedures here in the U.S. Then that person is then extradited to Mexico to face those allegations in Mexico under Mexican law. The other thing is that a lot of questions came out almost immediately, me included, is, well, can they be charged with accessory here in the U.S.? It's a little bit more complicated than that, because fundamentally, I think one of the big issues is going to be that video. You've seen it. Most people have seen it or seen portions of it. But the reason why you haven't seen television stations air it, because you can't authenticate it. There's some authenticity issues, like who took it, when was it taken? Can that be authenticated, which may pose some evidentiary issues, because it's not what you know, it's what you can prove. So from a prosecutorial standpoint, that is true, but it's also true from a defense standpoint. It's not what you know, it's what the state or the government can prove. I've been doing defense work for 20 years, less than 2 years that I was on the bench as a judge, and authenticating material is critical. Seeing it is not enough. Hearing voices is not enough. People saying that is who the person is not enough. You still have to authenticate the actual original recording itself. Again, probably another podcast for another day. But I think to the heart of the question, well, what can they be charged with in North Carolina, if anything? Well, it depends. Has a crime happened in North Carolina? One of the big ones that people have been floating around is accessory after the fact. It has its own elements, but it is harder to prove, because you have to prove the intent of that person, right? So an easy example, let's say I get ticked off. I didn't get good Christmas presents. I'm going to the North Pole. I'm going to go kill Santa Claus. This is probably not the best example. It's just what came to my head, but let's roll with it. I go to the North Pole. I kill Santa Claus. I come rushing back home. I tell my husband, my boyfriend, oh my goodness, I kill Santa Claus. I got to get to Bulgaria because I know that Bulgaria is not going to extradite me. I need your help. Boyfriend, husband says, okay, I don't want them to come get you either. Buys me a ticket, takes me to the airport. I escape. I get to Bulgaria. That's probably going to be accessory after the fact, because you have to prove the intent, right? So the intent, he could get up there and say, I never had the intent all day long, but it could be proved circumstantially by him buying the ticket, taking me to the airport, helping me escape, right? So that's where it becomes a little bit more complicated, because what, if anything, happened in North Carolina after the alleged crime occurred in Mexico that could rise to the level of there being some sort of charges possibly here in North Carolina as far as accessory. That's more complicated, because again, you have to prove what a person's intent is. The conspiracy, for example, because there's been a lot of questions about that, would also travel to Mexico in theory, because that's where the crime allegedly occurred. 2 or more people reach an agreement to commit a crime. They reach that agreement to actually commit that crime. Again, it's an intent-based crime, and it would control by what the definition of that is under Mexican law and not U.S. law. So there's so many layers to this, and we'll have probably a live conversation about this soon as things develop. But I think one of the things that, for me as a woman, I wonder out loud many times, if her name was Stephanie, if she was white, would it have taken this long for people to pay attention? Would it have required hashtags and people pushing this on social media for her family and her spirit to rest and for her family to get justice? I doubt that. And I think that's a bigger symptom of that, and the fact that people can watch another person in distress and pick up a phone before offering assistance. So many layers to this. But stay tuned because we're going to be talking about it. If you haven't done so already, go follow at the Convo Pod Show on IG and all things social media. And we'll see what happens from here.